Welcome to Fundamentals of Philosophy. This is Module 1, and our first module will be concerned with the question, what is philosophy? To make things a bit more accessible, I expect to split this lecture into about 3 sections of about 20 minutes each. This first lecture will begin with a brief history of the Western philosophical tradition. From there, we will take a closer look at the Beardsley's conceptions from our reading regarding the distinction between ordinary questions and philosophical questions. And finally, we will apply the Beardsley's framework to the historical context of both Socrates and Bertrand Russell to show how philosophical questions operate behind the scenes to structure the ways that we understand and interpret our world. Now, there is no single definitive answer to the question, what is philosophy? And over the course of this term, we will be returning to this question again and again from many different perspectives and in many different forms. To begin, it's worth noting that the question, what is philosophy, is itself a philosophical question. There is in fact an entire subdiscipline of philosophy called metaphilosophy that is devoted to this recursive inquiry which examines the philosophical project from the inside. Metaphilosophy is philosophy turning its restless gaze upon itself, interrogating its own nature, and thinking critically about its own methods of critical thinking. This first module is an exercise in metaphilosophy. So the most straightforward answer to the question of what is philosophy might be that philosophy is whatever is typically taught in philosophy courses like this one. In most American universities, what is taught is a version of the history of philosophy that is known as the Western philosophical tradition. In this version of the story, philosophy, from the Greek philosophia, or the love of wisdom, begins around 2,400 years ago in the ancient city of Athens, Greece. This form of classical philosophy percolates through the medieval Christian period, before radically transforming during the European Enlightenment or early modern period, after which it splits into 2 traditions: the distinctly Anglo-American analytic tradition and the distinctly European continental tradition. Our textbook, Exploring Philosophy by Stephen M. Cahn, is an anthology that is mostly written squarely within the bounds of the Western philosophical tradition and primarily within the tradition of Anglo-American analytic philosophy. But it's important to recognize that this is only one version of the story. By the time the Greeks had invented philosophy, Chinese philosophy had already been maturing for around a century, and Indian philosophy predates both by about a millennium. Currently, some of the most exciting contemporary philosophical work is coming out of non-Western traditions, such as African and indigenous philosophies. Now, the 3 readings in Cahn Chapter 1 collectively present one general answer to the metaphilosophical question of what philosophy is. We will spend the first module of this course unpacking that answer, and then we will spend the next 7 weeks putting it to the test and seeing if it stands up. So we begin appropriately with the article, What is Philosophy? By Elizabeth and Monroe Beardsley. Writing in the 1960s, the Beardsleys were concerned with offering a naturalized and demystified account of the nature of philosophy. Philosophy begins with ordinary, everyday observations. A headline pops up on our social media feed about some local criminal receiving a prison sentence for some petty crime. Good, we think. They broke the law, they should go to jail. We generally take it for granted that criminals should be held responsible for their actions. This is what the Beardsleys call an ordinary belief. It represents part of a network of commonplace assumptions that shape and inform our actions and judgments in countless invisible ways. We inhabit a world that is constructed by networks of ordinary beliefs. Mostly, they don't show up as beliefs at all. They're just the way things are. Except that they aren't. Because beneath the surface of every ordinary belief lies a vast, interconnected web of deeper, more general and more fundamental beliefs. Why does the criminal deserve punishment? Because they broke the law. But why does breaking a law mean that someone deserves punishment? Is using oppressive force to retaliate against lawbreakers always justified? Was the law itself a good law? What is it that makes a law good or bad in the first place? Note the progression here. We start with an ordinary belief about a specific case, right? The imprisonment of a single individual. Then we start picking away at the foundations of that belief, looking for the cracks in the reasoning. Each question draws us deeper into more general and more fundamental territory. Soon, we're no longer talking about one criminal and one punishment. Soon, we're questioning the nature of justice itself, the basis of moral responsibility, the foundations of legal authority. We've shifted from an ordinary belief to questioning what the Beardsleys call philosophical beliefs. So, ordinary beliefs, philosophical beliefs. There are two key factors, according to the Beardsleys, that make a belief philosophical as opposed to ordinary. First, a philosophical belief is highly general. It applies to broad categories of things rather than to specific cases. Second, it is highly fundamental. It deals with the basic assumptions that support our entire network of ordinary beliefs. So philosophical beliefs act as a sort of conceptual scaffolding that gives structure and form to the architecture of our ordinary, everyday worldviews. These beliefs are often invisible, operating beneath the level of conscious awareness, working behind the scenes to shape the ways that we understand and interpret the world. They're ambient in our culture, and as a result, they are almost never challenged or examined or questioned. They're just simply accepted as the way things are. Right? Every society and every historical era has its own set of ideas about the way things are, which is to say that they have some set of ordinary beliefs that seem obvious from the inside, but that might seem strange or even appalling from a vantage of another time or place. In our readings, when Bertrand Russell writes about the common sense of practical men of his time, he isn't paying them a compliment. He's laying the groundwork for an ironic demonstration that the reverence for material progress is neither practical nor sensible. Similarly, when Socrates excoriates the unexamined life of his Athenian prosecutors, he is placing the entire web of beliefs at the core of his society on trial. Both Socrates and Russell emerged as famous philosophers against the backdrop of empires that were at the height of their power. The Athens of Socrates was a city of extraordinary wealth, influence, and contradictions. It was history's first recorded democracy. Every adult Athenian citizen was granted full political participation, regardless of birth or class, so long as they were not women, slaves, or immigrants. Athenian citizens celebrated reason and debate, and yet they consulted oracles for guidance on personal and political matters. Athenian leadership spoke eloquently on freedom, while simultaneously maintaining an exploitative empire that was built on slave labor and secured by colonial wars. To maintain their influence over the city's political machinery, wealthy aristocrats paid hefty fees to have their sons educated in the arts of persuasive rhetoric by traveling teachers that were known as sophists. The sophists were history's first paid educators, first people to teach for money. It would be the equivalent to modern-day political spin doctors or marketing consultants. For a price, they taught that truth was nothing beyond the construction of winning arguments. That's all that mattered. And that justice was no more than the skillful manipulation of public opinion. Familiar. Similarly, the Edwardian Britain of Bertrand Russell was dominated by the political influence of wealthy aristocrats. This was the early 20th century, at the height of the British Empire. Britain had at this point colonized a full quarter of the planet's surface. They ruled over approximately 400 million people. This is something Athens couldn't even conceive of at their height. It was a colonial project of breathtaking scope, and it had been driven by the emergence of industrial capitalism and the acceleration of technological innovation and the administration of bureaucratic efficiency. And Britain's position of global dominance appeared to validate this worldview, which reduced all value to the principles of material production and market utility. So in both cases, the Athens of Socrates and the Britain of Russell, the ordinary beliefs of everyday citizens had come to reflect this deeper set of philosophical assumptions. The pursuit of material success had begun to obscure the question of whether or not this conceptual scaffolding represented anything that was actually true. And the success of these projects appeared to be self-validating. All serious and practical men recognized that this was just the way things are. And anyone asking inconvenient questions about these assumptions was considered dangerous to the interests of the empire. Now, it's worth pausing at this point to consider what we take to be the ordinary, common sense beliefs that are held by all practical people in our own time. Are there assumptions that we take for granted? Beliefs about the way things are become so naturalized through everyday use that we no longer recognize them as beliefs at all. How might the ordinary customs and practices of our time and place show up to a future anthropologist examining the culture of the early 21st century? What, if anything, might appear strange or even appalling to such an investigator viewing us through a radically alien cultural lens? Now, in the following lectures, we'll look at the ways that Socrates and Russell both set about challenging the prevailing dogmas of their time and place, what Russell refers to as the tyranny of custom. And we'll stop here for this one. This is part one. Moving on to part two next. See you there.